Philosophy is not very sexy. You ever seen a bunch of bearded bald bros sitting around a table in tweed jackets arguing about epistemology and thought to yourself, are you boys a bunch of grocery store products? Because I got a cutout coupon to get in that ass. Yeah, me neither. But if there is one branch of philosophy that exudes a subtle sexual energy, it's existentialism. The school of thought cooked up by some stylish French folks while drinking cocktails and chain smoking at hip cafes throws away all that boring logic to think about radical freedom, responsibility, and a world without God. This makes it pretty attractive to those of us who prefer cafe life to library life. It's also why we've talked about it a ton over the years. So much of our favorite media explores ideas like freedom, identity, and a lack of consistent meaning.
Hey, if your mother and I had to split custody, who would you guys choose?
Doesn't matter.
And existentialism is the perfect tool to understand these deeper themes. But this unabashed love of French philosophy risks ignoring the fact that existentialism also has a lot of problems and a lot of critics, especially those who are suspicious of the idea that we all really have radical freedom. Existentialists have been criticized by other philosophers, writers, political theorists, and even theologians. But no one has been harsher on existentialism than the existentialists themselves. Which makes sense because aren't we all our harshest critics? So does existentialism still have a use in 2023? Do the thinkers who came up with the school of thought even stand by it? Or was it just a trendy moment fueled by day drinking? Let's find out in this Wisecrack edition on existentialism, why it changed. So to really talk about existentialism, we need to go back a bit, as it emerged largely in response to some of the styles of thought that preceded it, most notably things like idealism and rationalism. Now, the very basic gist of both idealism and rationalism is that reality is an understandable structure that's knowable via reason. Think about someone like Descartes here. With idealism, especially of the German variety, this thinking goes further, arguing that there is a consistent and ideal structure that applies to both the objective world, which is, nature and the stuff that's outside of our humanity, and the subjective world, stuff like human consciousness. Now, essentially, your subjectivity shares the same DNA with objective reality, and the two can then be reconciled into one big thing by what Hegel calls the process of spirit. Now, importantly, if our consciousness and reality share the same structure, then everything becomes more or less knowable via reflective thinking. And I can do all of this from the comfort of my living room, which could lead to reflection being seen as more important than action, and thinking in terms of objective reason could be seen as more important than thinking about myself as a specific individual subject. Now, Kierkegaard was at university while this type of thinking was all the rage. And while he was influenced by idealism, he worried that this way of thinking treated life, existence, and individual subjectivity as conceptual structures to be understood in rational and logical terms. And he was especially worried that idealism was going to turn religion, which is something he thought of as grounded in faith, into something wholly logical. This led him to pivot away from objective reflection and towards an emphasis on subjective thinking and categories like the single individual, faith, and decision. For Kierkegaard, we can't just sit around and think about things all day in hopes of getting it right. We need to take risks and leaps of faith in creating our own subjectivity. And while not a self-proclaimed existentialist, Kierkegaard's work was the 19th century blueprint for what would follow. Also, if you want to learn more about Kierkegaard, illegally download my book on him. Don't pay money. It's good, but don't pay money to the publisher because they just stopped sending me money. I don't think it's a lot of money, but I would like to have that money. So if anyone wants to hit up anyone at Roman and Littlefield International Publishing and email them with the subject line, "Where is Burns' money?" I wouldn't be mad at you. That could be a fun thing for us to do, a little political action with your buddy Michael. Why not? And what followed was proper existentialism, a philosophical sensibility that emerged in Paris in the 1930s. Now, most of the earliest existentialists wrote not only formal academic work, but also plays and novels. Existentialism was particularly conducive to creative expression because it focused on the individual's lived experience, their passion, anxiety, and emotions. It's also why movies today still pull on these themes all the time. Now, the early crew of existentialists included folks like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. While all worthy of their own YouTube videos, let's start with Sartre, who famously gave the school of thought its initial motto: existence precedes essence. And in case you didn't know, in Drake's song, The Motto, that's what he's talking about. The idea here is that you are who you are, not because of any inherent or predetermined structures, but rather because of your very existence. And while this type of freedom can seem enticing, it's also anxiety-inducing because it means we are wholly responsible for who we are and what we do. Now, Sartre called the denial of this fundamental freedom bad faith, a sort of performative self-deception by which we try to act as if we aren't free. Like an Irish American saying, well, they just have to be a cop. Or Sartre's famous example, which is a waiter who acts as if waiting tables is his destiny. He simply is a waiter. Now, while much of this meshes with Kierkegaard, Sartre and his drinking buddies took things in a more godless direction, describing existentialism as nothing else but an attempt to draw the full conclusions from a consistently atheistic position. But this isn't the sort of angry 17-year-old atheism we talked about in our recent nihilism video. It's an ontological project of thinking through what it means if there is no God. Now, the same quote goes on to say, in this sense, existentialism is optimistic. It is a doctrine of action. Because if there is no God and it's just us, then we're responsible for what we make of ourselves in the world. And we're responsible for the creation of meaning. For example, we see this sort of vibe in recent films like Everything Everywhere All at Once and Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, where there's not really a coherent, determined reality and individual choices end up shaping both subjectivity and the world.
Everything is just a random rearrangement of particles in a vibrating superposition.
Now, for some, this brand of existentialism is attractive because it emphasizes our own freedom and responsibility. But others might see it as insufficient, lacking concern with concrete aspects of existence. Because surely someone born to a wealthy family in a developed country doesn't have the same type of freedom as an orphan living in poverty in the developing world. And it would be silly to say that we're all equally free when things like skin color, sexual orientation, and access to wealth can drastically determine our possibilities. And this is why the work of another existentialist, Simone de Beauvoir, is crucial. Now, she was more aware that biological and social factors can limit our subjectivity and freedom, which makes sense as the sole woman in the early crew of existentialists who lived in a world that was super duper patriarchal and misogynistic. So totally different than our own. In her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity, she explores the seeming contradiction between Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom and the constraints and limits of material circumstances. She writes that, however, man does not create the world. He succeeds in disclosing it only through the resistance which the world opposes to him. In other words, our free action is always carried out against the resistance of a world of facticity. For example, it's only when you can't afford the good cuts of the hog that you creatively figure out how to use the scraps to create the glorious hot dog. Shout out to our director Lux, who recently threw a hot dog party. If there's pictures of that party, I implore him to include one in this video. She went on to apply this thinking to a question that almost 100 years later, no one really cares about anymore: the distinction between sex and gender. I'm kidding, people care about it a lot, especially in America. It's not good, and there's better stuff to worry about, and it's just like, what are we doing? I think that's my attitude towards most of the political and cultural discourse in 2023. It's just like, what are we doing? And let me know in the comments, should we make a Wisecrack shirt that's like, Wisecrack, what are we doing? And we'll make it. In her book, The Second Sex, she wrote that one is not born, but becomes a woman, basically applying the foundational motto of existentialism, that your existence precedes your essence, to the question of gender identity. And she argues that biological sex doesn't determine gender, which is something that is shaped via your existence. She goes on to outline why women are the second sex, as man has been the universal term used for humanity as such, i.e. when referring to humanity in general, we use the language of man.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
With woman being something that is other. This creates a social and political world in which women are always categorically in a secondary position and have to use men or adjacency to men to acquire power. In this way, de Beauvoir takes a more social and political lens to existentialism, acknowledging that radical freedom has limits and that society is structured in ways that drastically determines the possibilities for those without universal identity, i.e. European men, a group that I was recently accused in the comments of a Wisecrack video of being racist against. This guy, racist against European white men. This project was furthered in the 1950s by Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist and philosopher Franz Fanon, who was also inspired by and friendly with Sartre and de Beauvoir. Now, it could be argued that Fanon further brought existentialist freedom into contradiction with the real world by applying it to questions of racism and colonization. Now, Richard Pitthouse describes Fanon's work as a combination of Sartrean existentialism and Marxism. In his book, Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon described how blackness had been created as a wholly other category to that of whiteness, like de Beauvoir had done for woman as an otherness to man. He argued that a colonized black subject must use the language and culture of whiteness to gain social recognition. In other words, a black person must put on a white mask to gain their humanity in the eyes of the white colonizer. The solution to this, in so much as he outlines one, is basically creating a new humanism that transcends the foundation of whiteness and the otherness of blackness by just rejecting those racial hierarchies. As Fanon writes, we believe that an individual must endeavor to assume the universalism inherent in the human condition. In another text, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon writes that for Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new man. I.e., to truly have a universal humanity, it can't just be that everyone gets to participate in whiteness. We need to create something altogether new. So where does this leave Sartre? Did the more radical takes on existentialism by the likes of de Beauvoir and Fanon leave his work in the dust? Or was the old man able to keep up with the changing times? Well, in an interview from 1969, Sartre said that, "The other day I reread a prefatory note of mine to a collection of plays and was truly scandalized. I had written, whatever the circumstances and wherever the site, a man is always free to choose to be a traitor or not. When I read this, I said to myself, it's incredible. I actually believed that." He's saying that his previous emphasis on radical freedom went way too far in terms of not acknowledging the way in which material and social conditions limits this freedom, especially relative to political forces. Also, side note, I think it's a good sign when a philosopher is willing to change their mind and critique their older work, because you're really going to tell me you had an idea in your 20s and you're just going to repeat that idea forever? That shows me that someone's selling you a brand and not selling you a willingness to actively be thinking. That's just one person's opinion. Now, in the years since writing his book Being and Nothingness and getting the whole existentialism ball rolling, Sartre had gone through a materialist transformation and realized that his early work lacked a proper account of the way that material, social, and economic forces place very real constraints on our freedom. And if you want to know more about this type of materialism, check out our recent video on Marx. Now, this led him to explore ideas around dialectics, and more specifically, Marxist materialism. Dialectics, which we find in Hegel, is the idea that thought develops via antagonism, and that ideas often have dialectical relationships, which basically mean that the productive force of thought is contradiction. But this doesn't mean that if you want to think ideas that you should just be a dick and just start debates. Not what it means, to be clear. Now, for example, we could say that the contradiction between the will of the masses and the rule of the monarchy leads to an idea like democracy. Building on this, Marxist materialism argues that it's the antagonism between humanity and the material world that shapes history, meaning that something like the wheel didn't emerge just because humans are super smart, but because they experienced a direct antagonism between their desire to move heavy stuff long distances and their inability to do so. Or like how the antagonism between wanting to drink beer and also wanting to use our hands led humans to develop a beer helmet. Also, if you're mad that I didn't just take out a beer helmet and put it on and you wish we had a budget for prop comedy at Wisecrack, consider joining our Patreon, because then we'll make more money and we could do prop comedy. And let us know if you sign up for Patreon that's why you joined. You also get stuff like our videos early without ads. We have a Discord server. We make extra content. There's a link in the description. But I'll stop now. But think about it, me in a beer helmet, that could be us, but you playing. Sartre's interest in Marxism seems like a far cry from his Kierkegaardian days of radical freedom and subjectivity, as Marx was way more of a concrete social analysis guy than he was a radical leap of faith guy. In one of his later texts, Search for a Method, Sartre writes that, thus Marx, rather than Kierkegaard or Hegel, is right, since he asserts with Kierkegaard the specificity of human existence, and along with Hegel, takes the concrete man and his objective reality. Another way to put this is that classical existentialism was stuck thinking about the experience of the free individual without having the tools to understand how this freedom can be constrained and shaped by objective forces like sexism, racism, or class. Now, Sartre explores this in his second great work, The Critique of Dialectical Reason, which is a very weird and long book that he legit wrote while mainlining amphetamines. Editor's note, if you want to write a good book of philosophy, you should not mainline amphetamines. In this book, he writes that my formalism, which is inspired by that of Marx, consists simply in recognizing that men make history to precisely the extent that it makes them. This means that relations between men are always the dialectical consequence of their activity. Now, while that might sound like it was written by someone who just snorted 11 rails of Adderall, he has a point. He's saying that, sure, humans are free to do whatever we want, but we're not free from determining material, social, and political factors. Think of it this way, like you're allowed to listen to your podcast with no headphones on the subway, but you're not free to stop teenagers from throwing rocks at you. Rather than saying that it's an either or between radical freedom and material determinism, Sartre thinks the move is to put these things together as a part of one larger process. And in doing so, Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Fanon all end up arguing for a position that's a much more socially and politically radical version of existentialism. Okay, so we've learned a lot today, but why does all of this matter? Well, if you look at early classic existentialism, you get a lot of emphasis on individual subjectivity and responsibility. You are free to change yourself however you see fit. Meanwhile, other schools of philosophy, many of which were pretty anti-existentialism, were focused on material conditions and how we could think systematically about changing the world, with individuals just being actors in that process of transformation. To put it differently, classical existentialism offers a sort of apolitical approach to existence, where I am responsible for myself and free to do what I want, which might be helpful if you're on a retreat, by yourself, staying at a cabin, in the woods, trying to do self-improvement and stuff. But it's less helpful when you come down from the mountain and have to exist in a complex and fractured society full of social and material forces pulling you in 9 different directions. And if the very folks who came up with existentialism went on to argue that their early work wasn't really adequate to deal with the complex social, political, and material reality they were engaged in, we then have to ask ourselves if we can read their earlier work without considering where their thought ended up. And further, we might need to ask ourselves what freedom really means in a world where our place of birth, skin color, or economic class can have radically different effects on what's possible for us. But what do you guys think? Would really love to hear about it in the comments. Also, do let us know if there's other philosophers or philosophical schools of thought that you would like to hear us talk about and break down. We want to keep making videos like this. We thank you for encouraging us to do so. So let us know so we can keep that ball rolling. And a huge shout out to our patrons. Your support means a lot. If you are interested in supporting our channel, getting videos early with no ads, you guys hate ads. You hate that we do them. I get it. But this way you don't have to watch them. And you get extra content as well, access to our Discord server. There's a link in the description. Check it out. But thank you so much to all of you for the support you give our channel by taking the time to watch our videos. Thank you for sharing them. Thank you for leaving comments, especially the weird ones. Those are fun, but it all helps us out a lot. And of course, as you know, we gotta feed that hungry algorithm. And if you want more, feel free to follow us on TikTok or Twitter. We're there too. But in the meantime, I don't know, go outside, practice some freedom, but remember that your freedom has limits. We'll see you next time. And thought, Daddy's up next. And thought, let's get married so I can have sex with you because I'm a Christian. And thought, if I were president, I would pardon you from not having sex with me. And thought, lather me with butter and put me in your oven because I'm trying to get roasted, boys. Well, where did that come from?